Okay, so this is the third of our timely topics sessions. In this one this afternoon, we'll be focusing on intervention. We'll have a look at your ideas that you put on the chat board in the Jamboard in just a moment. But just to let you know where we're at in this series. So our timely topics series, we've had a session on looking at Key Stage 2 results. Last half term, we focused on feedback and retrieval. Today we're going to focus on intervention, but the other sessions we've got coming up in February, we're looking at exam preparation and that final push in developing our current Year 11s. And then finally in June, we'll be looking at planning for next year's Year 11. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for the other two as well. So let's think about what we mean by intervention. So I'm just going to switch onto our Jamboard and see what sorts of ideas you'd put on first. So we've got ideas about additional work outside of lesson times. Maybe that could be during form time, maybe it could be in after school revision sessions. But we've also got this idea that we're helping students with holes in learning and that it needs to be targeted groups helping to improve outcomes. I think that we can probably all agree that those are they're all descriptions of interventions and what we might understand by interventions. Hopefully this afternoon we'll explore maybe some extra ideas and thinking about how we can make sure that we're really maximising what our students get out of those intervention sessions. So when we're talking about intervention, and I think we sort of summarised some of this before, but by intervention, I mean any strategy employed to address gaps in pupils' learning by focusing on specific areas of need. So someone had mentioned about those holes in learning. Often this is a type of targeted teaching programme conducted in small groups or one-to-one sessions. So some of the key things there are it's working in small groups often, and that it's specific areas of need. The more targeted we can be, the better to make sure that we're genuinely addressing areas of need. Well executed interventions can significantly boost progress and close the attainment gap. But they're quite costly because we're focusing on small groups or sometimes even one-to-one settings. If we're not focusing the right interventions on the right topics with the right pupils, there's an opportunity cost to everything we do, and our time is limited, and so is the pupils' time. So it's really important that we're getting these things right. And it might be that we also need to make sure that the interventions aren't just with the right students and on the right topics, but also that they're being delivered by the right people and in the right way to make sure that we're maximising their impact, which is a difficult balancing act when we want our most skilled practitioners to be doing lots of things, and people can't do everything all at once. So, thinking about the most likely areas to intervene. Actually, I'm tempted to ask you to just type in the chat, what type of students are you generally intervening with? So which types of pupils are you generally getting to take part in your interventions? Okay, so lovely. Those that want to improve, which I'm sure is absolutely all of them, definitely all the time that want to improve. Year 11 low ability, and we've got borderline grade 4. Okay, so obviously the specific pupils that you're going to intervene with might depend on the context of your school and where the most pressing need is, looking at where your data is at the moment. But some of the places where we often think about interventions are at our basics measures, so improving our 4 and above and our 5 and above, so thinking about those borderline grade 4 pupils. Sometimes pupils achieving 7 and above, if we've already been quite successful at converting maybe our basics measure pupils, we might then think about what are our top end doing? Are we getting enough pupils achieving 7 and above? Because we know that that can impact on our overall progress scores for our departments. Or we might be thinking about pupils not currently grading. So that could be year 11 low ability, but of course there could be all sorts of reasons why pupils in year 11 aren't currently achieving a grade on the most recent mocks, for example. So thinking about those 3 types of groups, if we're considering the basics, then we'll naturally want to consider what the matchup is with English, because that can have quite an important impact on whole school measures. So often we'll be looking at, on those Quixote documents, we'll be looking at the basics grid that tells us who's currently achieving grade 4 and 5 in English, but not maths, and vice versa. And those pupils might naturally fall into some of our intervention groups. If we're focusing more on the top end, so thinking about pupils achieving grade 7 and above, we might want to bear in mind who in our classes is thinking about studying some sort of post-16 maths option, or if they're not already thinking about it, who should really be thinking about maybe taking A-level maths or core maths, and can we use some of that future planning as a bit of a carrot, giving pupils the motivation to want to improve. If we're thinking about interventions for pupils not currently grading, we might need to consider whether they're actually attending maths or whether they're attending school. Is it that we just don't have data for them at the moment? Or is it the case that there's someone who maybe isn't attending at the moment for whatever reason, or didn't sit the mock exams, but we can feel fairly certain that they would if we did have that data for them? If we don't have mock data for them, what kind of data do we have? And is there anything that maybe suggests whether there's someone who genuinely, if they sat a GCSE paper tomorrow, wouldn't be able to achieve, because that sends us down one route with our interventions? Or is it someone who we actually just need to be attending school regularly, or we need to know what's the plan for their education? And of course, interventions could take place with anyone at any time. They don't always have to be with our year 11s, although I appreciate that that's where your main focus is likely to be at the moment, and that's where we'll be focusing this afternoon's session. But it is worth mentioning that the current year 7 to 10 will be year 11 of the future, and some of you might have been part of the Hearts for Learning trial with the calculation strategies. That is another potential type of intervention that could be on the go. But since we're focusing on timely topics, interventions with year 11 are probably where most of us are thinking at the moment. So when we're trying to narrow down who we're going to intervene with, so it might be that out of those main groups that we talked about just now, there might be one in particular that you're thinking of where you know you need to be focusing. So we need to know, looking at our data, where are we now? So where is our year 11 cohort now? What are our percentages of pupils achieving 4 and above, 5 and above, 7 and above, or achieving a grade, depending on which group? But we also need to think about what we're aiming for. What would success look like in our departments? Because it's not necessarily the same in each of our OAT schools. Then we're considering which pupils are genuinely going to be the ones that could bridge the gap. There might be some who aren't currently achieving those grades that you're aiming for, but you know that actually they can get there themselves without intervention. It might be that we need to target somebody else who's convertible but needs our help to get there. If we leave them as they currently are, they are not likely to get there. But with the right kind of push and filling in the right kinds of gaps them, they could get there. There might be other considerations as well. So out of the pupils that we're considering, are they part of any of these cohorts? Are they pupil premium? Do they have special educational needs? Are they looked after students? Are they EAL? Each of those things could make it more difficult for them to bridge the gap without our help. So they're more likely to be the ones who are potentially convertible, but they need our help to get there. They're not going to do it on their own. Sitting alongside that, we've got things like their attendance. So is it worthwhile putting somebody in an intervention group if actually we know that, I don't know, 80% of the time they might not actually be in when that intervention is running? Or someone whose attitude to learning is really poor, and actually they might benefit from intervention, but they could just as easily spoil it for other people. Those are considerations we need to bear in mind when we're putting together these small groups. So let's think about what the nature of the gap could be, because we've said that we need to be really targeted and we can't intervene on everything. Our approach might differ depending on what the nature of the issue is, but also on how widely it applies. So thinking quite broadly first, when we look at our mock data, is there a clear gap between calculator and non-calculator papers? And that gap could go either way. It could be that actually their non-calculator skills and their written and mental strategies are really strong, but they fall apart on a calculator paper and they're not using them effectively yet. I'm sure that you'll all have seen Claire Clay's brilliant videos and calculator cards. So if that is a particular gap, it could be that that's a strategy that you use with your teams and with your pupils to try and develop their calculator skills. Is it a particular strand? So, for example, one of the schools that I'm working with realised when they looked at the analysis of last year's summer exams that things like ratio, which had previously been a problem point for them, the pupils are now being really successful at because they've made some adjustments to how they teach that particular strand. But what was lacking now is some of the statistics and probability topics, particularly at the higher tier. And when they looked in more detail at their curriculum, they realised that actually there's not as big a focus on those topics in year 10 and year 11 as there could be. So that's a particular strand where they need to address it with their curriculum, but also they might need to address that with particular pupils in year 11 too. Is it a broad topic? So, for example, area and volume. And we can start to identify some of these through things like our question level analysis from the mock exams. But actually, it might be something that we pick up on in our teaching as well. It might be that we've noticed a particular sticking point, and we know that when we are addressing those topics with our pupils or with that particular group, it's always an issue. I'm thinking of one of my last year 11 groups where for some reason they just really did not like SERDs, and I couldn't understand it because I love SERDs. But it seemed that every time, it's probably the curse of knowledge there really, isn't it? But I realised that every time there were SERDs involved in something we were doing, they'd hit a bit of block, and we really had to do a lot of targeted work to unpick that. Or it could be a specific topic. So something like finding the mean from a grouped frequency table, which is something that I'm sure you're often finding you're needing to address in your intervention groups or with the pupils you're intervening with. Or the nature of the gap could be more to do with exam technique and method selection. So I'm thinking of those pupils where when they've done an exam paper and you might be returning them to the pupils and they say something like, oh, if I'd have realised that question was about Pythagoras, I could have done it. So is it that their math skills are quite strong, but they're not able to select the right method and unpick what the questions are actually asking for? Of course, in order to identify what these gaps are, we're going to need a bit of data for our class. So think about what kinds of information you've got that's allowing you to identify the gaps. So I already mentioned about the question level analysis, and that's probably something that we rely on quite heavily as teachers a lot of the time. But don't discount those that kind of teacher observation of what you're noticing with your class in general or with specific pupils. So are there maybe particular pupils where they just haven't got to grips with negative numbers, and actually that's the sticking point for topics that you're working on rather than the topic itself? Um, and it's quite easy to think about pupils that you're teaching yourself, but how are you going to know the gaps of pupils taught by other members of the team? What sorts of information can you get? What sorts of information do you need? And it might be that there needs to be a conversation held with other teachers in your team rather than just relying on the data that's on the drive. Data only ever tells us part of the story. It might also be worthwhile wondering about whether or not these are isolated issues, maybe applying to one or two pupils, or is it a particular group of pupils, a particular class, a whole year group, or repeatedly. So I'm thinking maybe about the example of the department I mentioned before. They'd previously known that ratio was an issue because their pupils kept on performing poorly, and that was repeated across multiple year groups. So they needed to take a wider approach than if it just is something that is occurring in your current cohort. Okay. Um, I appreciate that I've kind of rambled on quite a lot. I'm wondering if much of this resonates, and I, I'm wondering if people have some suggestions for how you go about identifying the gaps for pupils, either in your class or across your team. Feel free to unmute or type into the chat. So, how do you go about identifying the gaps for pupils in your class or across your department?
Hi, Emma. To answer your question, I think so after any sort of formative assessment that's been across the board, I think that's the easiest way of picking it up. My kind of bigger concern really is I think since COVID, we've been putting on, I say we collectively here on the core have been putting on interventions for Year 11s, but what's not happening is the same number of students working independently. So that kind of their own resilience and, well, I'm going to actually do something about this myself rather than us spoon feeding all the time. That's kind of one of my bigger concerns around intervention. Okay, we're running morning interventions, we're running period 6 interventions with them, and we're still spoon feeding them. But how do we go back to that stage where students take it on upon themselves to then say, well, I need to do something about this on my own? That's my kind of bigger concern.
Yeah, now we might well touch on some aspects of that later on, because those sorts of things that you're coming across in terms of resilience, and I agree with you, it's something I've noticed increasing since COVID. We can't sit it for them, and we can't do all of it for them. We are a limited resource, and I see a lot of teachers bending over backwards for their pupils, and I agree that we need to be able to motivate them to do it for themselves as well.
So it's not just the maths, is it? It's that kind of, well, teaching them to get back to being independent again. Yeah.
yes. However, there are definitely things that we can do as maths departments that can help to kickstart that process. So in particular, it might be that part of our intervention is modeling to pupils and showing them exactly how they can be resilient and independent at home. So I can see that Ryan had said about starting with QLAs and then drilling into the linked topics. A lot of departments are providing pupils with the question level analysis following the mocks, but we can't assume that just because we're giving that to pupils that they know then exactly what to do with that. And it could be that, say, if I'm a pupil who's presented with a printout where it looks like everything is red and yellow, how do I know where to begin? And how do I know what to do to address that? And am I actually going to feel like addressing that? Or am I going to look at that and think, well, there's no point because I'm doing badly at everything? So there's something about how we present that information to pupils and how we direct them to deal with that that could go some way. But yeah, I wish I had a magic wand. I can see, is that Ryan with his hand up? You got something to add on this bit?
Yeah, hi guys. Just adding to what I've written in the chat, I was going to keep writing, but it would have been quite a lot. Off the back of our QLAs, we looked specifically at grouped missed information, and then I went through quite painstakingly, but as classes, we went through individuals, their actual papers, not the QLAs, because it tells you the topic variant, not the skill that they're lacking. And then we've linked we've looked at any skills that combine across topics. And what I've done is from that QLA and that process, all of the heads of department across the school have year 11 forms. So I currently am on my second rotation since the mocks. I am taking individual groups that are lacking the same topic band, and every single day for 25 minutes during form time, I am drilling into those missed linked topics, which is going to obviously close a lot of gaps. And because we spent a long time looking at not the topic, but the skill that they're lacking or misunderstanding and grouping those students together, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that it's going to really close gaps. But I don't know if anybody else has the ability to do that or has thought about doing that.
Fab, thank you for that. And I really like what you were saying there, your point about the QLA doesn't tell you everything and that you need to have a look at the question itself. I think particularly on the current version of the curriculum, that interlinking of topics, multiple topics in one question is a lot more prevalent, and that tees up quite nicely something we'll have a look at in a bit. But also, yes, if you can address skills that are transferable across topics, then that session is going to have a wider impact than if you're focusing in on something that, okay, well, they struggled with that particular question on that particular exam, but it's not necessarily going to be a perennial issue or something that crops up multiple times. So you've got to think about those kind of high leverage areas, haven't you? Fab. Okay. So let's move on a little bit. So you see, it's almost like I'd shown this to Ryan before, because you teed this up perfectly. So the QLA only tells you how the pupil did on those questions on that day. It doesn't tell us everything about what pupils know or do, and we know that the questions are going to involve multiple topic areas, and we can't tell just from the QLA exactly which bit it was. On the Jamboard, I have put this QLA in on the second slide, and I wondered if, even bearing in mind the limitations that we've just mentioned and the fact that we know that the data only tells us part of the story, but if this is the information that you have to hand, which topics are you targeting first? So if you could just add something in on the Jamboard, please. Okay, right. So I can see that there's a few different approaches on the Jamboard. So and I'll also include Neil's suggestion from the chat, because he's saying that he worked at a school a few years ago that focused on everything. Their approach was to speed up the green as well as tackling the red. So I can understand the thinking behind that, I think, because in a similar way to how we were saying, just because a topic is red on there and it says it's this particular topic, we don't know exactly what the issue is there, or it might just have been something about that particular question. That could be a similar thing with the green questions. Just because it says here that they've got full marks on writing numbers as percentages of other numbers on this one question doesn't mean they're always going to be able to do every single question that uses that skill. We've also got someone on the Jamboard suggesting starting with the amber ones as they partially get it. So that means that we're not going straight for things that they've got no clue about at all. We're trying to make sure that they're maximising marks on things where they already have some idea. I'm wondering if I'd be able to guess who put on rearranging formula, understanding area and volume, shape and knowledge. So where we're thinking about that kind of broader approach to tackling things that are going to cover multiple questions. And then we've got some suggestions for specific topics. So angles on parallel lines, scatter graphs as a quick fix, and direct proportion. So we've got a few different approaches there. And in a way, it was a bit of a mean task to give you, because you don't know the actual pupil. And if we knew the pupil that sat this paper and had that as their QLA, that might change what we do about it. But I was being quite mean and just giving you the data. Now, obviously, you'll all have your own individual reasons for how you made your decisions. And some of that will be down to the ways that you know you're able to run your interventions. And the just by virtue of me showing you this data, you've probably started kind of formulating almost a mini plan in your head of how you like the schedule of how you would want to work with that pupil to help them address and improve these areas and improve their scores. And that will depend on the resources that you've got available to you. But I'm also wondering how a pupil would know what to prioritise, because we mentioned before that sometimes we give these sheets out to pupils and we go, okay, here's your QLA. I've been guilty of it before. I've said, here's your kind of personal revision list, but it's kind of not really, because it doesn't cover everything that they need to know. And it doesn't give them clarity about exactly where they should start or which things are most important for them. Even though in my head originally it was bespoke to them, it doesn't give them all the information that they need. For example, I know that if I handed this to some pupils and gave it, said, this will tell you the things that you need to work on, they're going to look at something like this: solving geometric problems using vectors. Oh, look, that question on vectors, there's 7 marks that I've not got. Well, the reality is most year 11 schemes will not cover vectors until right at the end, because it's incorporating lots of other topics and relying on quite a foundation of knowledge first. So the reason they've got no marks might be that they've not even been taught it yet. But I know that I've taught pupils where they would want to zoom in there first. That's not really what I would want them to do. So they need a bit of guidance in how to deal with that. I also know that there might well be some teachers I've worked with before who would home in there where they're getting 0 marks, and we need to bear these things in mind. Something like scatter graphs, which some of you identified, I agree that it's got some really quick wins. It's also got some of those transferable messages about a need for being accurate, a need to be able to interpret scales properly. I'm thinking of some of the kind of common mistakes that we see with scatter graphs, but it's I think someone even put it, it's quite a quick win and it's really achievable. Another area that people identified was angles on parallel lines. So even though they're amber, there's still quite a few more marks to achieve just on this paper alone, and there's likely to be further marks across others. So thinking not just about angles on parallel lines, but angles in polygons, it looks as though from the scores that they've achieved on those questions, that their general work on angles and angle rules might not be as strong as we want it to be. So, having identified some topics, and just on that, we might want to think about topics that are best bets. So things that we know crop up time and time again are going to be really high leverage topics. If I'm sure you probably will have seen them before, but First Class Maths put together files about the number of times different topics appear and which papers they appear on. They're quite helpful to guide some of those decisions. Also on GCSE maths questions .com or .co.uk, they've got heat maps by exam board. That includes OCR as well, which First Class Maths doesn't. So if we're not entirely sure which topics are the ones that crop up really often, they can be quite good for guiding us or guiding other people in your team as well if you've got less experienced staff. Okay, so we've started to identify some of our topics. We're maybe thinking about when and how it could happen. So we'd already mentioned some of these about after school sessions. You might have tutors that are working with you. You might be able to take pupils at form time or small group withdrawal. You might be running things like masterclasses, especially if it's a topic area that's a problem across a wider range of pupils or multiple classes. So there's a few different ways that we can address this. We've also got some digital options. So Complete Maths Tutor is an online tool that I think you've all had sessions introducing you to that before. Sparks or Maths Watch. I think most of our schools have an online platform that they're using at the moment, whichever it may be. And it might be that we want to give pupils opportunities to use those during the school day or after school so that we can start to build some of that independence, but with a bit of guidance. So almost bridging, or giving them time to work on things and address things during the school day. But if we're struggling maybe to staff some of those sessions with mathematicians, we want to make sure that they're having that focused time where they're definitely going to be doing some work on these, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be using our best maths teachers for those interventions. Or it might be that there are some wider interventions we want to consider. So it might be that we need to make some adjustments to our long-term plans. We might have spotted something that's a real issue across the cohorts, and we know that we need to address that, not just for this year 11 group, but for the future. It might be that we need to address those calculator skills we were talking about. We might want to use walking, talking mocks. Now, I've put in targeted because I've seen these used in lots of different ways. Often, or certainly the first time anyone talked to me about walking, talking mocks, they meant the whole cohort en masse in an exam hall with one teacher at the front modelling the paper. Now, that sounded all a bit terrifying to me, if I'm honest. What I used to do is identify specific areas that I wanted a group to work on, and that could be a group of pupils from across classes. So at one point we really needed to support a particular group of pupils with problem solving questions. They just couldn't see how to break them down. I took out a group from across several classes, made a bit of a fuss of them, and that was who we did a walking talking mock with that week. And we just focused on picking out the AO3 questions, giving them time to tackle them, then I'd model them, and we sort of repeated that process. And that was the focus that week. But the next week it might be pupils where keep on coming back to calculator skills, but they just needed to know how to use the calculator. So we focused in on questions that were going to highlight particular functions and making sure that we were able to model them and then practice them. So there's different ways of doing it. It doesn't have to be everyone in the exam hall going through a full paper. That's not necessarily going to be the most beneficial thing to everyone. Walking talking marks is a walking talking mock type approach, but with individual questions. So it could be used as a starter, maybe with some of your quick wins that you might identify for your particular class or somebody else's particular class. So model the one that was on the paper that they struggled with, so that they've got a clear guidance on how to approach that question, and then a parallel question that they can attempt. So a lot of the exam boards are now doing shadow papers, so sometimes you can use the original question as the one you model, the shadow question as the one for them to attempt. But if you're just picking out one or two particular questions, it doesn't need to take a long time. SSDD problems might be something that you want to make more use of. So same surface, different depth problems, one of Craig Barton's websites. So questions that look similar on the surface, but they require different strategies to solve. Could be something that would help pupils with method selection in particular. Or it might be that one of your interventions needs to be a session explaining really clearly, this is how I want you to revise maths. Because I still encounter some pupils who think that they're going to revise maths by taking their book home and reading it through, whereas I think all of us here probably know that the best way to revise maths is to actually be doing maths, but something needs to happen in between them not being able to do a question before they're actually able to do it. So they need some clear guidance on exactly what you mean when you say, I want you to revise. Okay. So thinking more about how a standard intervention session might run. We've identified that our pupils are struggling with angles on parallel lines, and they've also lost marks on angles in triangles. And so what this teacher has done is go on Corbett Maths, find the questions on angles on parallel lines and angles in triangles, and they're going to use this as part of their intervention session. Is this intervention addressing the key issues, do you think? So type what you think into the chat or feel free to unmute.
Just going back to what you said earlier, we don't know what part of the question the student didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's difficult to say whether that intervention is any good. It also isn't really giving any guidance onto how to, it's just practice on if you already know how to.
Yes. So it might perhaps form part of our intervention, but perhaps this isn't going to address everything that they need. Okay, any other thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, 'cause it might be that they could calculate the angle, but are missing the, because it's an alternate angle or because it's corresponding angle or that description, it might be where they're losing the marks. Yeah. So.
Absolutely, yeah, because they obviously were able to do something that was worth credit because they've got 1 mark out of 2 on part A and 1 out of 3 on part B. So it might be that this isn't actually hitting the specific bit they were struggling with. So this is the question. We've already had a suggestion from Ian that they might have been able to identify, well, they might have been able to calculate the angle but not give the reason. What sorts of things do you think might have been the problem in part B? I still can't hear you, Neil. Sorry. If you type in and while you're typing, I'm sure it's looked like Ian had something to suggest as well.
Yeah, I think, like, I mean, possibly they may get the first mark for saying that the angle next to 125 is 55 degrees or something like that, and start to build up the answer, but then got stuck because they couldn't see it was going to be an angle in a triangle eventually somewhere along the line, or yeah, they just couldn't, the sort of the problem solving bit of it, they didn't know where to start, I guess.
Yeah, and Neil is saying that they might assume that it's isosceles. Now, I'm starting to really worry that you two are in my brain, because that is exactly the those two things combined are exactly where I was going with this when I was thinking about a stunt answer, because this is the sort of thing that we see quite frequently, where pupils can do something that's a good start, but then they make some assumptions that are incorrect, or they struggle to get that next step. And actually, judging by the working that I've put on, they know that angles in a triangle add to 180 degrees. So if all I'm doing with them is this sort of practice, where, as Timothy said, the diagrams are quite simplistic. We're not really getting into very meaty questions here, are we? We're just focusing on that kind of surface level understanding of the rules that they need. This is what they need to be able to tackle. It's a multi-step problem, and actually they do know some of the things that are being addressed here, but they're not able to put together those multiple steps. So now that we know that, the sort of intervention that we might want to put into place is going to change, isn't it? It might be that we only need to do a quick check. So a quick check, maybe with some diagnostic questions or something like that, to make sure that they know the basic rules, and the focus of our time is spent more on building them up and applying them, or making sure that they can give reasons, or yeah, making the questions more and more complex as we go through. But just that kind of real surface level, this is a corresponding angle, this is what angles in a triangle add up to, doesn't look like it's going to do the job here. We also need to bear in mind, it's not just about this question. This is the one they struggled with in the exam. We want them to be able to apply that knowledge and understanding in whatever form those skills are going to be assessed, or wherever they might need to use it in the future. So we don't just want to be fixing the issues we can see right here. We want to make sure that we're giving them those skills and grounding to apply it wherever they need to. But we definitely need to be using questions that are a bit more complicated, and where we're building things up. And that's probably going to get us closer to something that might fix those issues fully. Okay, any more thoughts on this particular intervention, or this particular topic?
I think it's the difference between knowing how to do something and problem solving, isn't it, on that particular question? And the problem solving is very, very difficult to teach without constantly modeling your thought process with when you are answering this type of question.
Yeah, definitely. And we need to have that good grounding in the procedural knowledge first, don't we? And, you know, that's some of the thinking perhaps behind tackling some of those amber topics, because they obviously understand something about that topic first. And it might be that they've got to grips with rules and procedures and processes. And what they really need us to intervene with is, okay, how do I build that up into something more meaty? Okay, so we said before about sometimes we need a different sort of intervention because the issue might be more about the pupil's motivation and effort. And well, we want to make sure that they're wanting to do the work, not just us spoon feeding, like Ian was saying before. Um, Sometimes the sort of intervention that's going to have the most impact is actually conversations with pupils, depending on who those pupils are. Um, Thinking about what do they actually want to do and what are their plans for post 16, and worryingly quite a lot of them don't always have a plan at all and think that something will just magically happen when they get the envelope on results day and a plan will appear. If we can get them starting to think about that earlier, or acknowledging the fact that you might not have a plan yet, but let's make sure you've got some options, and starting to think in that kind of way, that can sometimes be a bit of a lever. Um, Sometimes people's confidence is really quite low and they don't always believe that they can achieve a decent GCSE grade. And sometimes, if we're honest, we don't believe that they can either, which is ironic when we're putting them into these interventions because we want them to improve. I can see Ian's hand has gone up while I've been saying that.
Yeah, I've got a Year 11 tutor group as well, and they're sort of doing college and school applications for post 16 at the moment. And some of them are applying for like level 2 qualifications, and they're not very far off, like sort of achieving what they need for the level 3 qualifications at college. And like, well, apply for the level 3 and you know now what you have to do at school. And it's kind of, they're not making that link between what they're having to do now and how it affects their future. And it's very difficult to have those conversations with the whole of the year group. I think, like, well, that they are done, but it's just not sinking in still. It's just still not sinking in that if you do get 5 GCSEs, then that's going to make a massive, it could save a year at college. So, you know, what it gives some meaning as to why we're asking them to work now. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, ultimately it's not as though that one conversation is going to fix things for every single pupil. And you know, I'm sure people probably tried to tell me an awful lot of things when I was at school that I was dismissive of at first, or even if I believed them, I probably still needed to digest it a bit and start to view things a bit differently. Ryan, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else is having the same problem, but our local colleges and sixth forms, obviously all of our Year 11s have had their interviews and whatever else. They've been informing students that a 3 is okay for entry onto the course. And when I've got students that are in, you know, which I've been pushing, you're a 6 or a 7, and they're literally from the middle of November after their interview, it's just a nosedive. And when they're set on doing whatever course it is, it's driving me bananas. I've actually just written to lots of people in different colleges just to say, can you at least allude to the fact that some students may be allowed on with a lower grade if there are spaces, rather than say the acceptance level is lower. It's really difficult. I actually have just moved 3 students out of top set because they're refusing to work. They know they can walk into the exam and get a 4. And you know, it's heartbreaking because over a long period of time, they're going to really kill you know, our progress 8, every grade they're dropping, one of them's a HPA. So it's really difficult. So something I've been doing in my form, because obviously I said I was rotating them, is reminding them, and this information I got from the local council, there are not enough spaces in local colleges for the number of students within the council area. So you have to sell yourself with the best grade possible. And that I'm using data, so it's, it can't be argued against, but it seems to help a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. The need to realise that there is an awful lot of competition out there, and that can, it's not just competition now either, it's competition in the future, because I think this is one of the things that maybe us as teachers find even more frustrating, is we can see the bigger picture and we can see how these things might pan out further down the line. I mean, if I was doing what I thought I would be doing at 16, we wouldn't be having this conversation this afternoon. Things change quite a lot, but you give yourself options for the future, and they need to view it not just as competition now for what they want, for next September, but competition later on as well. But it's I'm sure those are conversations you've already been having with them, and you probably feel like you're talking until you're blue in the face, but eventually the penny will drop with some of them. So are they actually making the most of all the opportunities that they've got? So I had pupils who would be shouting at me for not offering them enough intervention sessions after school. And I went through with them, these are all the things that we're doing in class. These are the things that you should be doing for your homework. These are the ways that we're giving you chances to revise, and these are the practice papers that you can do. And I said to them, if you're doing all of those things and really getting the most that you can out of them, do you think that you need to do more maths? And all of a sudden they weren't shouting at me for not putting on revision after school for that group. But I'm sure that there are probably pupils that we're putting into intervention groups where we know that they're not currently making the most of the opportunities that they do have. And that's definitely not all on us, but it is worthwhile having that conversation with them, especially if they're the pupils who are quite reluctant to take part in some of these interventions. So actually, if you were making the most of every maths lesson that you had, I probably wouldn't feel the need to be asking you to attend X, Y, and Z intervention. This goes back a little bit to what we were saying about guiding pupils around how to use QLA or exactly what revision means, but setting pupils really clear targets. And this often feeds into conversations with parents as well. Pupils who we know need to improve their grade, we're quite likely to be contacting home for them as well. And if parents know clear targets of what we want them to do in terms of what they should be doing in class, or what they should be doing for homework, or what they should be doing for their own personal revision, and then we make sure to check that that's done and maybe report back to parents if we've had that conversation. If pupils know that we're checking up on what they're doing and checking that they're meeting those expectations, they are more likely to actually do them. And obviously we need to think about, again, that opportunity cost. Our time is a finite resource, but you can probably call to mind a small cluster of students that it'd be most beneficial for you to be setting targets for them and checking that they're following up. And you don't necessarily have to do that with every single pupil, but there are probably some that would benefit from it more than others, and then maybe start responding to it. And I'd said about parents and carers, but that could be a phone call home. It could be making sure that you're making the most of parents' evening. What sort of information are parents and carers given at parents' evening, and could they be given more information? So I used to print off like a sort of general information sheet that then had space on the back for particular targets for for the people I had in front of me, and we'd maybe note some down over the course of the meeting. But it would also have things like, this is the exam board, these are the ways that they can revise at home, this is the calculator they should have, these are the revision websites we want them to use, kind of key information that we wanted everyone to have. And for your key characters, follow up with some sort of report on their progress afterwards. So we are at 4:30. A quick summary of the things that we've looked at this afternoon. Our time and energy are finite resources. We can't intervene with everyone or with every single topic, so we need to be selective and make sure that we're choosing the ones that are likely to have the most impact. We also need to choose those high value topics that are realistic to fix. So not things that are way beyond where our pupils currently are and they're lacking the underlying skills. Fix the underlying skills first and then we'll see. Intervention is no substitute for pupils getting the most that they can out of lessons. So we do need to make sure that we try and maximise that. And we need to make sure that we're choosing the right intervention for the issue. So sometimes that means digging a bit deeper into exactly what that issue is. So thank you so much for your contributions this afternoon. Obviously, if there's anything else that you'd like to comment or you'd like to ask about, I will be staying on for a little bit longer. But if not, thank you so much for joining in and for giving your suggestions. Sure that people will have found it valuable to hear what you've been saying.